Dynamic systems see change from a new perspective. Todd Rose explains how small levers can make the biggest impact.
So the systems change idea, right? So dynamic systems is just a fancy word for systems that change, right? That's all it is. So scientists in dynamic systems spend a lot of time trying to understand the nature of change in systems. And then, of course, from educational perspective, there's a nice history of some leaders looking at that kind of idea of systems change. So there are parallels, and one important thing which we spoke about earlier is this idea of how you view variability in a system. So sometimes when you think of a system like, say, a school system, the people at the top like to have a lot of control. It turns out that's not how systems work. Stable systems do not have centralized control. They don't survive very long. And so what happens is when we want to affect change in a system and we have a static view, we often think, well, what we need to do is get that superintendent to decree something, right? And then it all trickles down, and it doesn't work that way. And anyone that's ever been in a school system knows it doesn't really work that way. And so, first of all, understanding that to change a system, there's a big point that people should understand, which is the input versus the output is not linear. So we often think if we got to change a school, you need to find some big thing to push on to get some big effect. So we'll spend lots of money revamping something that we think should have a big effect, and it ends up having a very small effect. Usually in dynamic systems, the effect is what we call nonlinear. A little bit of an input can have a huge effect on the output. And so, we've seen this in popular culture. We talk about like the butterfly effect, but in the case of systems, one thing that we look for if you're trying to catalyze change is looking for the smaller levers. And they're usually rooted in the lower level of a system. They're not at the top. They're not at the level of superintendent. They're about the teachers in classrooms who actually understand the dynamics of what's going on. And so one thing that I would suggest is getting good insight from the educators in this system about what they think the levers are for change, because they often have very, very large effects. The second piece is that even if you did that and allowed the educators to identify levers, if you have levels up in the system, like principals and superintendents, that still have a static view, they can actually nix any kind of positive change simply by the approach they have in the way they govern. And so allowing for a little bit of what will feel chaotic sometimes, thriving systems and systems that change in a positive way have a sense of turbulence to them. And having a mindset higher up, like a superintendent, of appreciating that turbulence and a little bit of variability is actually essential to a thriving system.